So I will work on that. In the meantime, today we want to talk about what happens to the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, once the priestly writer gets hold of the underlying Yahwist narrative. The bulk of the narrative in this section does belong to the Yahwist, as does the bulk of the narrative throughout the rest of Genesis. In spite of Blenkinsop's efforts at arguing, and he's not the first to do so, that the underlying narrative really is the priestly narrative, he really is not talking about priestly narrative. He is talking about the genealogical structure of the priestly writer, which is obvious in Genesis, but not so much anywhere else. And therefore, it is very hard to mount an argument that the underlying structure of our Pentateuch is given to it by the priestly writer if you're only using the evidence of the narrative material. There really is very little priestly narrative in Genesis, and what there is of it is always in the neighborhood of a large block of Yahweh's narrative. And it's very clear that what is going on is that the priestly writer is engaged in an editorial project to make you read the underlying Yahweh's narrative in a particular way. And so we want to look at the way that works out in Genesis 1 through 11, which is the most obvious example of it, and therefore the easiest to see. And that will give you some clues about what to look for later on when you get other priestly material that is put in place here. Now, when we get to the legal material, all the bets will change. There we have huge amounts of priestly material and practically nothing else. We have very little narrative in the legal portions of our Torah until we get to the middle of the book of Numbers, and then it resumes narrative only to submerge again in legal material by the time you reach Deuteronomy, which is virtually all legal material and sort of prose reminiscences on the part of Moses, trying to remember just what it was that happened way back at Sinai and describing it to you, but it will be a description, as we'll see when we get there. It will be a description that you don't recognize, having read the narrative previously about what went on in and around Sinai. So that's our problem for coming weeks. But I want to look today at Genesis 1, and the most obvious thing that the priestly writer has done for us in 1 through 11 is to provide us with a long and very obvious introduction to the entire book. And so if it fits a well-known pattern that if you want people to realize what your point of view is, you should have the first run at the material. So try to contribute the introduction to any joint project of which you are a member. And if you have the introduction, then everybody is going to read what follows it in the light of that introduction. And that's exactly what the priestly writer is going to do. Put a very large block of carefully crafted material. This is a chapter which has its own integrity. It's very carefully written, and right away you know that somebody has given this a great deal of thought. This is beautifully worked out. It has its own internal logic, although it may not be a kind of modern logic that we can appreciate until you begin to look carefully at it. We noticed when we were looking at the Yahwist narrative that there was much in the Yahwist narrative that really was not there when we wanted it to be there. The characteristic of the Yahwist is telling us what we need to know to understand the story. And other material, background information, and so on that we might really like to have and know about, the Yahwist does not seem to want to give us. So either because the Yahwist assumes we already know it, which is not true, or just because the Yahwist doesn't want to give it to us. That's not what the Yahwist is doing in the narrative. That is not a characteristic of the priestly writer. The priestly writer wants to do things, as some ecclesiastics would say, decently and in good order. And the notion of order is the thematic thread that ties together all of this priestly material in Genesis. So you want to pay careful attention to it, because the priestly writer is going to try to answer all of your questions. If you were reading this in Hebrew, which I hope someday you will be able to do, this is one of the best arguments for taking Hebrew, you will notice immediately that the prose of chapter 1 is very different from the prose of the Yahwist. It is a more technical kind of prose. It contains a number of words which you, as a first-year Hebrew student, will have to go to the dictionary to look up. There are words and constructions in chapter 1 that are quite deliberately structured there, but they are obscure even to modern translators. So this is a kind of technical vocabulary. This is not random thoughts on creation of the world and all that. This is material that has been very carefully worked out. The terminology is technical terminology. It has a clear meaning for the writer. It's not clear to us from a distance exactly what the terms always mean. So I want to walk you through it, and it is unfortunate that if you're following in your translation, you will begin to see at the very beginning of chapter 1 that there are problems in the text. If you begin to compare versions of the translation, you will begin to see where they are. That's a sure tip-off if you are worried about the underlying Hebrew text. Begin to compare translations, and where they diverge sharply, you will begin to suspect that there is a problem with the underlying text. That is a translation problem. It is not a textual problem in and of itself. And that is what we get in the very first words of Genesis. The standard King James translation in English forever was, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void," which implies a creation out of nothing. The earth had no shape, King James thought, or his translators thought, until God began to go to work on it. Unfortunately, that is not at all what the Hebrew text says. What the Hebrew text says is, "In beginning to create," is one possible translation. That is, when God started to create the heavens and the earth was tohu and bohu. That is, it was something. The problem, of course, is that we don't know what tohu and bohu are. So we can't go any further in identifying just what was there before God began to work on it. The word tohu is one that we know from elsewhere in Hebrew and from 2nd millennium Ugarit. The word shows up there. And it has the meaning wasteland, desert, areas which are outside of the control of human habitation. So Robert Alter's translation of this phrase, generally I'm not a great Alter fan, but he catches the idea here, and he translates it, the world was waste and wild. And he catches the alliteration there of the tohu vabohu. We have no clue as to what bohu might mean. It does not occur elsewhere. And some scholars, most notably H.L. Ginsberg, at Jewish Theological in New York, who is said to have known more Hebrew than Isaiah did, He always translated, he thought it was just a rhyming nonsense word. And so he translates it, the world was waste schmaced. You don't have to come from New York to get that, but anyway, that's what he thought it meant. So it is not exactly clear what it was, but the point for us in thinking about the cosmology of the priestly writer is that there was something there. The first word is, for those of you who already have some Hebrew, I'm going to try to make this simple, is in the construct state. And that means it has to have a completing noun or verbal noun of some sort following it. And so you have to amend the text to get the translation, or you have to amend the vocalization, not the consonants of the text, to get the translation when God began to create. Now, if you look at the new RSV, they seem to be trying to have it both ways. They translate in the beginning when God created. And that looks like simply a committee that has been into its mailbag and had a lot of complaints about the change that they made in RSV over King James. It could be that, or they could be taking refuge. We don't have notes for their translation, so we don't know what the discussion really was in the new RSV. But you can get there by invoking a very rare syntactical Hebrew construction, which is better attested in Akkadian. And that is a construct noun followed by an inflected verbal form, which creates itself a dependent clause. And therefore they translate two clauses there instead of only one. Very few people want to follow NRSV on this, and so you are not likely to see that translation anywhere else. I will tell you that syntactically it is possible. It adds up to the same translation as when God began to create. The point is the same, but I doubt seriously that that in fact is the construction which is being translated here. So that all still remains a mystery. When the Jewish Publication Society did its translations, and they incidentally do follow the when God began to create the heavens and the earth, because they are not wedded in the rabbinical tradition to the notion of creation ex nihilo. They don't have any theological stake in the notion that God created the world from nothing. They're perfectly comfortable over on the Jewish side of things with seeing an ordering process at work here, which is going to be apparent throughout the rest of the discussion of how the world got to be the way it was. So they're not bound by that, and that's characteristic of the Jewish Publication Society generally. They try very hard always not to let Christian theological affirmations of one sort or another color their translation. Once in a while they will slip when they get onto Jewish theological affirmations, and they will let that influence their translation from time to time. But you need to remember that translations are always done by committee, and committees take votes on things, and if you think that all translations are therefore accurate, they're not. They are simply the majority that could agree on a translation, and if the disagreement with the other members of the committee is violent enough, it will earn a comment in the footnote which says, or, and then they will give you the alternative. So that's the loser when you see it in the marginal note in the translation. So much for the sociology of translation committees. All right, so the point theologically here is fairly clear. In the beginning, Elohim, and here they're using very clearly the preferred priestly name for the deity at this point. The priestly writer will later introduce the personal name Yahweh for the deity only at the beginning of the Moses story at the burning bush. That's where, according to the priestly writer, the personal name of God was revealed finally to Israel. And so, not surprisingly for the priestly group, it was revealed in conjunction with Sinai. The place where the burning bush occurred is also the place where Sinai is located. And Moses, in the priestly account, is told that after the people come out of Egypt, they are to come to the divine mountain and worship God on that mountain. So the different sources have different ideas about just what they're to do once they come out, but that's the idea for the priestly group. And so it's not a great surprise that the divine name is, for the priestly writer, revealed only at Sinai and not at the beginning. The Yahwist is also equally clear that the divine name Yahweh was known from the very beginning. People began to worship Yahweh in this very early primordial period before much else happens in the narrative. And here we simply have a disagreement between the two sources about this rather important item. And in a minute, I'm going to attack the question with you, why do we have this kind of dissonance in the text? What does it mean that we have these conflicting views of what is going on in our text? Are they just being annoying, or do they not know? I mean, what is going on here? So it begins with a temporal clause. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, and that temporal clause turns into a circumstantial clause. The earth was tohu and bohu, whatever you think tohu and bohu means. So waste and whatever. And there was also darkness. So if you're looking for things that predate creation, and the rabbis will play that game a lot in the rabbinic literature and begin to give you lists of things that were created before creation, before the world was created. And of course, the land of Israel was one of them, according to some rabbinic discussion. How they get that out of this, since we don't have dry land yet, is a puzzle, unless Israel at the time was all underwater. And I have no idea how they get there. But that is one possibility. The Torah itself is said to predate the creation of the world, so that it was a kind of divine Torah which is eventually revealed to people, but somehow it existed in the mind of God before that all happened. Let's see, what else? Well, it doesn't matter. Wisdom, later on personified Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, was created before the world, and she tells you that. It says, I was created as the first of God's creation. So she was created before the world was created as well. What is striking is that our writer, the priestly writer, who is otherwise very careful to give you everything that you need to know about the creation of the world, does not tell you what the pre-existing state of things was. It begins simply with this temporal clause. When God began to create the heaven and the earth was tohu and bohu, and there was darkness. So we know that tohu and bohu existed. We know that darkness existed. We know that there is either a divine wind or the Spirit of God. Either translation is possible. That was, and then there's a word that we don't understand, doing something or another over the face of the deep. The tehom is the word that is used. And with the appearance of the word tehom this early in Genesis, it strongly evokes the Mesopotamian creation story, the Enuma Elish, which, like the creation story of the Yahwist, which begins with the temporal clause in chapter 2, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant. And then you get this long circumstantial clause that tells you what things were like before God began it. But it begins with this temporal clause, implying that there may be something before this, but we're not going to talk about it. And since chapter 1 begins with this kind of temporal clause, and the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, also begins with this. Enuma Elish, the first words of the epic of creation, means when above or when on high. The heavens had not yet been called by name, and so on. So it is the time before anything else began. One gets the impression that there probably is a kind of Near Eastern pattern for telling a story like this. And this is the kind of thing that Hermann Gunkel, in his form-critical approach, would point out to you, that all of these creation stories tend to begin with this temporal clause. When this happened, the earth was such and such, and then so you get the circumstances into which the creative act is then placed. And that's exactly what we are going to get here. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu and bohu. I'm not going to try to translate that for you. And there was darkness upon the face of the deep. This is, that word deep here translates to home, which is very similar to the Akkadian word tamtu or tiamtu, and the goddess of the primordial deep, Tiamat, who is the personified deep. And what they're talking about here is the cosmic sea out of which all eventually comes. So you have an anthropology here which talks about the pre-human condition somehow being imposed onto a world which came out of primordial water. And in Mesopotamia, of course, it is a deity who is the primordial water. You don't get the sense here that the primordial deep, the salt sea, is a deity. That is missing. However influenced the priestly writer was by the Babylonian story, and there is pretty good evidence that certainly the writer knew of it, and these resonances with it, using these words that come out of that tradition, is quite deliberate on the part of the priestly writer. The priestly writer is giving you an alternative creation story to the one that is known in Babylon, which is a good piece of evidence for thinking that the priestly writer crafts this story in its final form in the light of what they are hearing around them during the Babylonian captivity. And they want you to know that we also have a creation story, we Jews who are here in exile, and it is somewhat different from yours, but you will recognize the similarities when you hear it. We're simply reading things a bit differently from the way you are. It is a beautiful example of the way in which context of literary creation influences the way storytellers work. So whatever the pre-priestly version of this looked like, what we have now is very clearly being crafted for an audience that at least has heard about the Babylonian creation story. And this is supplying then an alternative to that. The first thing that is going to be different, other than the fact that there is no reference to deities in this early pre-creation state, the first thing is this Ruach Elohim, the divine wind or the Spirit of God or whatever this thing is, which is whatever the word merakefet means. We don't know exactly what that word means either. It shows up in Ugarit, in Ugaritic, where it seems to have the meaning to swoop. It describes what a bird does, a hunting bird, as it swoops down on its prey. So the idea seems to be that the divine spirit is not just sort of hanging out above the water, but is active in moving above the water. And it, so far though, is not doing anything. And the Ruach, the Spirit, is not going to be said to be a creative agent by the priestly writer. So we don't have a kind of liquid, primordial deep, which is being given shape by this divine wind that is running around doing things to the water. That's not at all the way that the story is finally going to take shape. It's going to take place in a very different way. And that too seems to be a difference in the two cosmogonies between Babylon and Israel. God's creative power in Israel is exercised in a very different way from the way that divine power is exercised in the Enuma Elish, which is going to turn out to be a struggle among the deities. So it's going to be a version of a combat myth. The Bible knows of this myth. References to it in its Canaanite form will appear in other places. Isaiah, for example, will have resonances of this and so on. But right now, the alternative is the Enuma Elish. That's what they're thinking of, and they want to provide you with another alternative. So what are things like? What is the background? We know nothing about what happened before this creative act, and everybody has been disturbed by that. It seems to begin, like chapter 2, sort of in the middle of things. And when people asked Martin Luther, who was a very careful reader of the text, what was God doing before God created the world, which is a fair enough question. Humans would be interested in knowing about that. Luther's response was God was cutting switches to beat people who ask those kinds of questions. So Luther was not interested in speculation, and in that point, he was very much like the priestly writer. The priestly writer also is not interested in speculating anything about what the divine being was doing within the divine being. Now, if some of you are headed toward medieval theology, you know that the medievals spent a great deal of time worrying about what the deity is in the confines of the deity. And that gets to be a whole matter of debate and discussion. Not the priestly writer. The priestly writer is interested in many obscure things, but that's not one of them. So it begins in the middle. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was tohu and bohu, and there was darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving or swooping over the face of these cosmic waters. And then finally, we get to a main clause. And notice the form in which it is. I'm going to translate it literally. And God said, "Let light be," and light was. The creation is by divine word, and that's going to be consistent throughout the narrative. This is not a labor that God undergoes in the context of fighting for supremacy with other deities. So it is not that kind of a creation story. It is a kind of effortless story, and the Hebrew has a special word that it uses only of God's creative activity. It's always translated to create, but the priestly writer uses it consistently to describe what God is doing in chapter 1, and it does not suggest the kind of human-like activity that the Yahwist portrays in chapter 2. Remember that the first thing the deity does in chapter 2 is to make something, and the word has to do with the creation of an object. It's used of a potter making something out of clay. And that's the analogy that chapter 2 is giving you for how creation takes place. Not in chapter 1. In chapter 1, there is no exertion on the part of the deity. There is no human-like activity, but rather a very unhuman kind of approach to creation. We cannot do this. Our creativity does not involve this process. We cannot just say, let it be done, and it happens. But this deity seems to be able to do that consistently, which already suggests that for the priestly writer, there is no divine opponent to this deity around. This deity is the only one who can do things like this. And so it becomes an argument for a kind of monotheistic notion of how the deity operates. And this is going to be characteristic throughout the narrative. When we get to the priestly writer on the contest between Moses and the magicians of Pharaoh, you're going to see the same thing. The Pharaoh claims to be a deity. The magicians claim to be able to wield divine power. But Moses' God is the only deity in the story. The other claims to deity are therefore false. The Pharaoh turns out not to be a god and cannot really compete with the God of Israel, who is the only genuine deity in the story. So this kind of thinking about the nature of the deity and the power of the deity is already present here in the beginning of the story. So let light be, and light was, and God saw that the light was good. This evaluation of what God does in the creative activity is going to repeat like a liturgy throughout chapter 1. It's going to come up every time God does something. And the reason for it is very clear. If you were to read the Yahweh's narrative by itself, you would think, as we did when we read through it last time, that there are problems with the way God goes about this. The narrative, as the Yahweh tells the story, gives you the sense of a kind of experimental nature to the creative process. The deity seems to be trying this, and it doesn't work, and then tries that, and it doesn't work. And finally, the deity tries something else, and that sort of works. So you get the impression that the deity is not going into this with a total control of what is going on. And that means that it is possible, in the Yahweh's view of things, to have a creation which is flawed and which can not only create good, but also evil. And we looked at that theme. The Yahwist is very heavy on the notion of inbuilt human sin and the possibility of people doing things that they ought not do. And it goes all the way back to creation, the Yahwist tells you, when they ate that fruit of the tree of good and evil knowledge. And the first kind of knowledge they got was not at all good. They thought it was a really nice looking tree. It was a good tree. It had knowledge, which was a good thing. But the first thing they got was evil. What's the first thing they knew? That they were naked and they were different from each other, and that the creation was not the unified thing that they thought it was. So you get this undercurrent in the Yahwist of the inbuilt nature of evil in humankind. That's the anthropology of the Yahwist. And it is not until we get to the story of Abraham where you finally get a human being who is willing to obey what God tells the human being to do. Now we're going to see where that works out on Monday when we look at those ancestral stories. That is not going to work out quite the same way that the deity wanted it either, but at least it's a step in the right direction maybe over what has been going on so far. That's not the world of the priestly writer. The priestly writer from the very beginning wants you to know that there's absolutely nothing wrong with God's creation. It is good. And that's going to include the people as well. Not only that, but when we get to the creation of the people, we are going to be told that it was really good. just to make the point over against the Yahweh. So you've got two very different anthropologies running here. One talks about people created from the ground and being capable of sin, and in fact only of sin. And here is the priestly narrative beginning to tell you, no, that's not the way it is at all. There's nothing wrong with this creation. It is a good creation, and everything that the deity created is good. So that begins originally in verse 3. So God said, let light be, and light was. And God saw that the light is good. Now we have something else. We had the darkness, and now we have light. And so we begin the first of a number of separations and boundary settings. The priestly way of looking at the world has to do with the setting of boundaries between things. And this will come out in the priestly legislation, most obviously in the distinction between clean things and unclean things when talking about ritual. And it's the job of the priest to determine which category things go in. So the priestly writer seems to be interested in categorizing things. And so now we have light and we have darkness. Now you may ask, logical person that you are, but what about the sun and the moon and the stars, the other light givers? We haven't had an account of their creation yet. That will come later. So how can we have light? And why do we have light here? Didn't they know that light is associated with the sun? And so, of course they did. The point here is that in order to create time, the alternation of day and night is required. The smallest unit of time is the day and the night, and that marks, or the light, the daylight and the night, and that marks the ability to count and to count days. And the whole narrative for the priestly writer is going to end in the creation of the seventh day, the Sabbath, which for them is the goal of creation and the time when, according to the priestly way of thinking about it, the world is capable of renewal. And if any of you have ever been in a Jewish service, you know that these references to the function of Sabbath as not just a time of rest, but a time when the world can be reset, when it can be rewound. I mean, once a week you have another shot at sort of setting the dial back to zero and going at it again. You can do the same thing yearly on the Day of Atonement and so on. So the counting of days and months for the festivals is a very important thing in the way that the Jewish community began to think about this. And so for the writer in Genesis, the priestly writer in Genesis, this alternation has got to be, the creation of time has got to be the first thing that they do, and that is the reason that God creates the light in order to form the alternation between light and dark. And so God names these things. Remember that in the Yahweh's account, it was the people who named things. God didn't seem to know what they were. God creates a bunch of animals and just sort of marches them by Adam. And it's Adam's job to look at them and say, that looks like a horse to me. And so it's a horse. That's what we are told. Whatever Adam called it, that's what it was. So it was Adam who recognized the essence of things. Here, there is no thought of doing that. God names these things at the very beginning, and by naming them, gives them their characteristic. This is a deity who is much more firmly in control of what is going on than the deity of the priestly writer. So it is a different world. So we begin this process of separations. There was evening and morning, day one. And so God said, let there be a firmament. We have no idea. This is a blessed word from King James. It just means something solid. It's used of a plate or a dish of something of that sort. And so it seems to be suspended between the waters above and the waters below. God divides the waters and places this thing in the middle. And the thing is going to become eventually the staging area for earth. So earth, in the priestly way of thinking about it, is precariously located between the underwater, or the underworld water, which is the splitting of this cosmic sea, and the upper water. And God is the force that actively keeps these things in bounds, which means that we are in a very precarious situation. Because if God quits doing that for some reason, then the two bodies of water are going to slam back together, and there's going to be nothing left in the middle. So the whole creation depends on God's continued creative activity. And for the priestly writer, creation is a continual thing, and just as it is ritually redone every week in the celebration of Sabbath, so also God continues the activity of preserving the earth in the midst of what really is a very perilous kind of situation. And so you need to keep that firmly in mind as well. So God called the firmament heaven, and there was evening and morning, day 2. And God said, let waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. So God called the dry land earth, and the water was called seas. And God saw that that was good. And God said, let earth put forth vegetation. So in chapter 2, God simply planted the vegetation. Where did God get the seeds to plant vegetation? We don't have any explanation for that. Here, God creates the vegetation, and within it are the seeds that will grow into further vegetation. So God makes a provision for the continuation of vegetable life. And you can see a kind of hierarchy now developing. The inanimate world has been created. Now we're going to get into the life world of vegetables. God, the priestly writer seems to think that these are living beings as opposed to dead beings. The Yahwist doesn't seem to have an opinion about that, or if the Yahwist does, the Yahwist is not going to tell us how they think about vegetables. But here it begins the first rung of a pyramid, which is going to eventually in humans at the top of the pyramid. So the plants are created, and they each have a means within them to reproduce themselves. And this notion of the order in which reproduction takes place seems to be important. Plant a radish, get a radish, not a Brussels sprout, is the idea behind what the priestly writer thinks is going on. And this creation is an orderly creation. They don't seem to know about what biologists would call sports, that is, things that don't reproduce after their own kind, which is how we get different kinds of flowers and vegetables through accidental cross-pollination or whatever causes them. So according to the priestly writer, all of this is a kind of ordered world. It's going to move then on to the different lights in the heavens. Notice that these are separated from the notion of light and darkness. These are separate creations here. And their main purpose is to not just show light on the earth, but to mark times and seasons. So this is another version of the creation of time, different kinds of time, which are marked by the differences in the position of the moon, the sun, and the stars. They are not deities in their own right. They are simply part of God's created order, and their main job is to mark the festivals that people go through. We move from there to the swarms of living creatures, and we've got birds created. Even the great sea monsters are created. So they know about the sea monsters, and they hasten to tell you that God created them too. These are not evil beings. of one kind or another who are enemies of the deity, but they are part of God's creation, and God can control them. I mean, look at what God says in this divine speech in Job, who refers to, and God there refers to these sea monsters and says, can you speak kindly to them? Will they do what you want? Will they hang around the house and serve as playthings for your children? God can do that. Job gets the idea that is being put forth here. The different living beings on the earth, things that move on the earth, creepy crawling things on the earth. And then finally in 26, God said, let us make human beings in our image. And in the priestly telling of it, humans, male and female, are both created together at one time. One is not derived from the other. They are at the top of the pyramid, and they bear the divine image and the divine likeness. And the word which is used there is the creation of a representational, three-dimensional object of some sort. And that's how they describe the making of the humans. They are the representative of the deity on the earth in a three-dimensional form. The deity, of course, does not have form, but if you were to create a form for the deity, it would look like human beings. They bear the image of God, and that's going to become a major point of the priestly story. Let us make man in our image and have dominion over it. The function of the humans is exactly the same function as we saw in the garden, where the human was created to tend the garden. Here, the human is created in order to have dominion over all of creation. The people are responsible for all of it, which includes the animals, the creepy crawling things, the fish. Everything is the responsibility of these humans who are being created. And then you have a kind of celebration of this. So God created humans in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them. There is nothing innately evil about people, according to the priestly anthropology. They are blessed by the deity and created in the divine image. So we have a very different picture of what is going on here in the priestly writer than we do in the Elohist. And God said, I've given you every plant yielding seed, every tree, every beast of the earth, and so on. Everything that creeps on the earth I have given you for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and it was really good. And there was evening and morning the sixth day. And so God rests on the seventh day, and that marks the creation of the Sabbath. Now, when we get to the next, and it's after this then that we get the creation story of the Yahwist, you can see what the priestly writer has done. By leading up to it in this way, this is what remains in your mind. And then we get the story of the creation of humans again, and now the creation of what happens in the garden and its aftermath. In case you have forgotten all of this in chapter 1, when we get to the next major insertion by the priestly writer, we are in chapter 5, and it is the priestly genealogy. And the important thing about the genealogy, and it's terribly important for the priestly writer, the genealogy talks about the transmission of the divine image explicitly in humans. And it begins at the beginning of chapter 5. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created humans, he made them in the likeness of God. You might forget that, having read the Yahwist narrative. But that's what they want to remind you of. So they're quoting chapter 1 for you, right? made them in the likeness of God, male and female. He created them. He blessed them. He named them human beings when they were created. So fixed their essence. And when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and named him Seth. So people are capable biologically of transmitting the divine image. And what you're going to get in the genealogy is the transition or the transmission of the divine image down to the period of Noah. After the flood narrative, you're going to get another genealogy which traces the transmission of the divine image down to Abraham and his relatives. So you can see what the priestly writer is doing here. You get a very different anthropology. You get a very different version of the flood. Because for the priestly writer, you will see that the flood, the problem with humans that causes the flood is the problem of violence. It's nothing inbuilt. For the Yahwist, God says about the people that they are only evil continuously. They can't do anything but evil, and therefore they can be wiped out. They have to be wiped out. Only Noah escapes, but Noah is human, and he also has this built-in tendency to do evil. And so the flood is a failure. Not for the priestly writer. The problem is a social problem. It is the existence of violence among people. And if you can stop violence, then you will be all right. So it is no accident when the priestly writer describes Noah in chapter 6. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. That's a possibility for the priestly writer, that people can be totally righteous. It is not a possibility for the Yahwist. There are no righteous people, according to the Yahwist way of looking at the world. So these two are very different in their anthropology. And next time I will talk a little about why you have such two very different views of humankind and of the activity of the deity in the same account as we now read it. All right, thank you. Have fun with the flood narrative.